listener production.
Hey, it's Helen Smith here with you. Welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, we unpack US President Donald Trump's 56-minute speech at the UN General Assembly, fact-checking his claims, including when he told world leaders your countries are going to hell over migration, and that, once again, climate change is a con job.
It's time to end the failed experiment of open borders. You have to end it now. I'm really good at this stuff. Your countries are going to hell.
But first, let's check the afternoon headlines. It's Wednesday, the 24th of September. The ABC has been ordered by the federal court to pay Antoinette Lattouf $150,000 in pecuniary penalties for terminating her employment, on top of a previous order to pay her compensation of $70,000, bringing the total to $220,000. In the judgment, the court found the broadcaster had abjectly surrendered to pro-Israeli lobbyists and let down the Australian public badly. The penalty is for breaching the Fair Work Act and the ABC's enterprise agreement when it unlawfully terminated Antoinette for holding a political opinion opposing the Israeli government on Gaza. The court found that the ABC's conduct was a particularly serious breach of employment law, and that was because of the ABC's senior managers knowing that there was an organised political campaign by pro-Israeli lobbyists to have Antoinette removed from air. There are calls for Optus CEO Stefan Roux to resign following the 13-hour O outage last Thursday that resulted in the deaths of multiple people. The telco has launched an independent review into technical failure following the network outage, which resulted in around 480 customer calls not going through to emergency services, with the telco CEO saying that the O outage occurred because staff were not following processes. It comes as Optus has just been fined $100 million by the federal court over predatory sale practices across 26 stores that signed up vulnerable customers, including those living with a disability, to plans they could not afford. And late-night host Jimmy Kimmel has officially returned to screens, being met with a standing ovation from his live audience after being taken off air over his comments about the shooting of right-wing speaker Charlie Kirk.
Anyway, as I was saying before I was interrupted, I'm happy to be here tonight with you. I'm not sure who had a weirder 48 hours, me or the CEO of Tylenol.
Kimmel went on to thank everyone who supported him and the show, and even thanked those who aren't fans of the program but supported his right to share his own beliefs, before breaking down in tears.
You understand that it was never my intention to make light of the murder of a young man. I don't think there's anything funny about it. I posted a message on Instagram on the day he was killed, sending love to his family and asking for compassion, and I meant it, and I still do.
Kimmel says he understood now why the comments may have appeared ill-timed, and added that if they were reversed, there was a good chance he would have felt the same way. Now, US President Donald Trump has slammed Kimmel and the ABC, the American broadcaster, an hour before Kimmel's return, calling them fake news and saying that it might be time to test the broadcaster, as last time I went after them, they gave me $16 million. This one sounds even more lucrative. Now it's time to get into our deep dive with Cory Alpert from Melbourne University and a former Biden White House staffer on Trump's speech at the UN General Assembly's annual meeting of world leaders in New York.
What is the purpose of the United Nations? The UN has such tremendous potential, but it's not even coming close to living up to that potential.
Cory, was Trump's speech an attack on the UN?
I think it's a little beyond that. It's an attack on the UN system a little bit, but it's, again, part of Donald Trump's project of attacking pretty much every other country in the world and using the UN as a forum for that. He, of course, had comments about the UN itself, and he later met with Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and said that he, of course, backed the UN 100%, whatever that means from Donald Trump these days. I don't necessarily see it as an attack on the UN itself, but I think he used a platform where, a huge number of world leaders are sitting in front of him, where he could, at least in his mind, assert a kind of dominance as he stands in front of them.
And we'll get into some of the claims that he made. One of them was that he has ended 7 wars. Is that true?
I don't think so. He's been repeating this claim a lot over the last couple of weeks, especially as he continues lobbying for the Nobel Peace Prize, which he sort of very publicly muses about his idea that he has earned the Nobel Peace Prize. He's referring to things like the skirmish between India and Pakistan, Armenia, Azerbaijan. There have been a couple of conflicts that I think he has been a unique force in, because he really has destabilized much of how countries relate to the United States and relate to the power center that the United States represents. But it's unclear what exactly the 7 conflicts he's exactly referring to. But credit where credit's due. I mean, he has played a role in at least a couple of these conflicts, at the very least not escalating further, or in the case of Armenia, Azerbaijan, really wrapping up after a long-term period. So, I think it's an exaggeration. He has done, I think, some good things in destabilizing how countries have related to the United States, related to each other. But this claim of 7 doesn't really seem to make sense.
Another claim that he made was about climate change, saying that it was the greatest con job, and he dismissed renewable energy projects. Now, these kind of claims about climate change, they're not that new from Donald Trump, but why has the reaction been so huge to the ones that he just made?
Well, first things first, I think what he's done is handed China a huge win as the future of renewable energy. I think most countries around the world are looking at the reality of stronger storms, of more wildfires. The consequences and impact of climate change, I think, are undeniable. And I think most countries around the world are at least privately taking it very seriously. And I think what Donald Trump is doing is positioning himself as the leader of a retrenched nation as China continues to export their own power, both sort of metaphorically and literally, as they export their renewable energy strategy. So, like you said, I don't think that these claims are particularly new, but you have to read almost everything Donald Trump does, not with an eye towards international engagement or, his attempt to bring peace to the world. He's speaking to a domestic audience. He's speaking to a domestic audience that he campaigned on bringing back coal mining and manufacturing and things that need, if we're actually going to seriously address these big questions of climate change, that need to be addressed and need to be moved. But when he's talking about climate change, he's not speaking to the rest of the world. He is speaking to a domestic audience so that he and his team can go on right-wing media in the U.S. and say that Donald Trump is confronting the rest of the world and standing up for American coal mining, even though we know that if we're going to survive as a human civilization, this really existential challenge of climate change, we have to move beyond coal and we have to move into renewable energy. And again, what Donald Trump here is doing is handing a massive victory to China, which goes against his own stated goals of putting the U.S. in the driver's seat of the global economy. But it's difficult to do that when you're moving away from the future of energy production.
Another thing that he told all of the world leaders in the room and everyone who watched online as well, that it's time to end the failed experiment of open borders. You have to end it now. Your countries are going to hell. That was over migration. Now, what did you make of those comments?
I think Donald Trump is doing two things. One, it's quite a veiled kind of white nationalist talking point where he's talking about migrants from especially African countries coming into Western Europe and changing what he calls, their civilization and all that stuff. That's all really from a white supremacist playbook here, arguing, that migrants from countries that are historically black and brown are going to fundamentally change Europe. And it's a dog whistle to his base, who are, I think, in some ways rightly concerned about the questions of migration and how we deal with, how populations are moving and changing, in large part due to climate change. I think we have to acknowledge, many of these migrants, especially from North Africa, are coming into Europe because of the threats of drought and famine that are coming from climate change. Again, this is all a way for him to get clips so he can play this to a domestic audience. I don't think he actually thinks he can convince any European leader to turn back every migrant. That's not his goal here.
In saying that, do you think this was an effective speech?
If we're looking at this through the lens of him taking this back to a domestic audience, probably. I don't think this will mean much on the global stage. I generally don't think that these speeches at the UN General Assembly do much to kind of move needles. These are countries posturing for their own domestic audiences and for their own projects that are happening at the UN General Assembly. But certainly for his domestic audience, I think that this was successful. And really, the important thing that happens at the UN General Assembly are the meetings that happened on the sidelines. We saw a very consequential meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky. There were some interesting things said in the meeting with Emmanuel Macron. And Trump himself said that the most important thing that he was doing in New York was meeting with leaders from the Middle East, especially the Emir of Qatar. So the speech itself, I think, was, again, him asserting a kind of dominance over the rest of the world, as he's always want to do. But I think the interesting thing is going to come from the conversations that are had on the sidelines of those meetings.
Now, you've worked and been within the UN, and you were actually at the UN HQ for Trump's Fire and Fury speech in his first term. What has the reaction been from world leaders on the ground and in the room to this speech compared to previous ones?
I was there for that Fire and Fury speech where he went after Kim Jong-un, which, set the stage for a whole bunch of high-profile meetings that never really resulted in anything. But what struck me at the time was just the kind of fear and shock and recoiling that you saw delegates in the room have at that time. And there was even a speech, I think it was his 2019 speech to the UN General Assembly, where delegates laughed at him, where he, was seen as really an idle threat, one full of his own fire and fury, but not really consequential. I think now, especially given what he's doing on tariffs and what he's willing to do with migrants in the United States, people are taking his threats more seriously. Because of these tariffs, I think countries have to take their relationships with him personally a lot more seriously, because they can't necessarily publicly oppose him on a lot of these issues, because he could quickly slap a 50% tariff on everything they're trying to export into the world's wealthiest market. I think that has really reshaped how world leaders have had to react to him, which plays in the room. What I'm seeing just from watching his speech and from reporters in the room, that folks were visibly nervous and uncomfortable, especially as he's denigrating world leaders. But he got polite applause on the way out, and it seems like no one really wants to poke the bear, as it were. No one wants to cause some great offense that might lead to really serious consequences for their own country.
Now, Trump's speech was very long. It was 56 minutes long, which is way over the 15-minute limit. But unlike speakers at Tuesday's conference earlier this week on Palestinian recognition, the microphone was not muted when his allocated time went over. Why do you think that was?
Again, I think the UN system and the folks at the UN don't have any incentive to tangle with Trump there. So I think two things are happening. One is that the UN, the folks managing the logistics at the UN, are not willing to cut his mic. You can only imagine what his reaction would be if he's standing at that lectern and all of a sudden his mic is cut. And at the same time, his staff is likely in the room where they're controlling whether or not that microphone's going to be cut. The other element of this is, of course, that the U.S. is one of the largest funders to the UN and to UN programs. And Trump is, of course, claiming unilateral authority over much of the federal budget. I think they're well aware that letting him speak for an extra 45 minutes is probably worth any of the heartburn that might come if they were to cut his speech short.
Going back to some of those meetings that always happen on the side, We have Anthony Albanese, Australia's PM, who's also attending the event for the first time, but we've got a date now. He's set to meet with Trump in Washington on October 20 at the White House. What do we know about that so far?
So there have been lots of kind of false starts on a meeting between the Prime Minister and the President. There are always kind of rumors swirling in the Australian media that I think are probably hopeful leaks from the PM's office that, hopefully he'll meet with Trump. We saw this at the G7 recently in Canada where Trump left early and canceled the meeting with Albanese. I'm curious what will end up being on the table. Of course, the Trump administration doesn't really have long-term priorities and strategies. It will likely be that they'll be discussing the news of the day, whatever that may be at the time. But I don't think anyone can predict what's going to be discussed in those meetings because even when the Trump administration announces an agenda ahead of time, it's going to be dictated by whatever the news of the day is, and Trump will likely do what he does with every other world leader, which is subject them to having to sit there while he gives a speech to his domestic media and then kind of gestures to the world leader that was sitting in the chair opposite. So I'm sure that the Prime Minister's team will be spending a lot of time trying to prepare for that meeting and figure out what they want. And I'm sure it's all going to change at the last minute as Albanese's flying to DC.
Cory, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thanks so much for having me.
That was Cory Alpert, a researcher from Melbourne University and a former Biden White House staffer. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. I'll be filling in for Natasha Belling over the next couple of weeks, but we'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning. Until then, I'm Helen Smith. Catch you next time.